I never intended to pick a fight with my next-door neighbor or wage a covert war involving honey and an army of bees. But when the local HOA's self-appointed dictator, whom I call Karen for reasons that will soon become obvious, trespassed onto my property and stole the apples from my orchard, I reached my limit. Anger is a powerful motivator, but so is cleverness, especially when you've had enough micromanagement to last a lifetime. If the world insists on painting me as some mild-mannered retiree, they haven't seen me in action when my orchard is under threat. I've lived in the quiet neighborhood of Sandalwood Estates for nearly 3 decades. My late husband, Martin, and I moved here because we wanted a peaceful plot of land, a place to grow a few fruit trees, and enjoy our golden years. Even after Martin passed, I stayed because the orchard became my anchor. I had apple, pear, and peach trees. The best part of my routine was waking up early, sipping my coffee, and strolling among the rows to pick out the day's fresh bounty. Apples were always a highlight, especially the crisp pink ladies in late September. When Karen moved in 3 years ago and immediately volunteered to chair the HOA, I had no reason to suspect trouble. She was all for smiles and helpful suggestions at first, but then she started scrutinizing everything: my lawn height, the color of my mailbox, even the position of my garden gnomes. For the record, I have 3 gnomes, each wearing a different expression, stationed by my front porch. They haven't moved in years. But that didn't stop Karen from delivering pointed remarks about unsightly yard decor. Sandalwood Estates, for all its picturesque charm, has an HOA that tries to keep the place uniform and tidy. I appreciate good aesthetics, but I also value personal freedom. If I want to paint my door teal, that's my choice, or so I thought. Karen took every rule in the covenants, some of which dated back to the early 1990s, and enforced them with near-fanatical zeal. She'd send me official letters for the tiniest deviations. One time, she claimed the shade of paint on my shed was 4 degrees off from the approved palette. 4 degrees. I can't even imagine how you measure that without specialized equipment. You might wonder if I confronted her. I tried. Believe me, I tried. The first time I addressed her about these petty issues, she plastered a pained, condescending smile on her face and insisted she was just doing her job. Homeowners need guidance, she said, as if we were a bunch of errant children who needed her watchful eye. Eventually, I stopped inviting her to chat. If she wanted to waste time policing my garden gnomes, so be it. The orchard, at least, was mine. No one had ever tried to regulate my fruit trees or meddle in my harvest, so I figured I had a safe haven. Apple season came and went without so much as a whiff of trouble. Until last fall. It happened on a Sunday. I went out early in the morning, basket in hand, expecting to gather at least 2 dozen plump pink ladies at the peak of ripeness. Instead, I found broken twigs, half-eaten fruit on the ground, and a conspicuous emptiness among the branches. At first, I thought it might be deer. We had our share of wildlife around the neighborhood, though typically I had fencing that kept them away. I scoured the orchard for tracks, found nothing. Then I noticed footsteps in the soft dirt on the west side of the yard, far from any gate or path. They didn't look like hooves, they looked like human footprints. Piecing clues together, I realized it had to be someone in the neighborhood. The orchard wasn't visible from the street due to my tall hedges, so whoever was either trespassed intentionally or knew it was there. It's unnerving to think a neighbor might steal from you. But I try to calm myself. Maybe it was kids. Sandalwood Estates doesn't have many children, but a bored teenager looking for a thrill wasn't out of the question. Still, the footprints seemed too large. Just when I was about to let it go, I spotted a piece of white fabric snagged on a branch. A slender, polyester scrap about the size of a dollar bill. I stooped to pick it up, rubbing its texture between my fingers. The HOA had mandated a certain style of yardwork attire for community events, if you can believe that. White-collared shirts. Could it be that Karen, queen of yard aesthetic, had hopped the fence and taken my apples? I tried to push away the thought as absurd. Karen was obnoxious, but she wasn't a thief, right? But as the day wore on, I couldn't get it out of my mind. It fit her controlling nature. She might have felt entitled to the orchard because, who knows, she believed the trees were community property under some half-baked interpretation of the HOA guidelines. The next morning, I saw Karen hauling out a compost bin, and I waved a cheery greeting from the edge of her driveway. Her face froze, suspicious. She asked, "Something you need?" I scanned her expression, searching for the slightest hint of guilt. But she gave me nothing, just that plastic smile that never reached her eyes. I forced myself to remain pleasant. Inside, my suspicions grew. For the next couple of weeks, I discreetly guarded my orchard, but no one returned. The apples on the remaining trees stayed intact, and I almost convinced myself that I was overreacting. Yet the piece of fabric didn't lie, and neither would my instincts, which told me Karen was behind this, and she wasn't finished. My chance to confirm my suspicion came when I noticed fresh footprints late one Friday afternoon. The orchard soil was still damp from a recent rain, so the impressions were sharp and defined. They led from behind the tall hedges all the way to the thickest cluster of my apple trees. Again, many apples were gone, too many for just a passing nibble. This was outright pilfering, plain and simple. I stood there, fists clenched, debating my next move. The most logical thing would be to set up security cameras, but the placement would be tricky, and I couldn't exactly hide them in the orchard without rigging some advanced contraption. I had never been much for technology, though. I'm old school. Give me a paintbrush and a shovel, and I can fix most things around my house. Electronics? Not so much. Still, I wasn't about to let Karen, or whoever else it might be, get away with this. It was time for a bit of cunning. The orchard had always been my sanctuary, so I knew every nook and cranny. I decided to camouflage a tiny old camcorder Martin had once used to film our grandchildren's recitals. It wasn't high-tech, no motion sensors or night vision, but it had decent battery life. I placed it amid a cluster of leaves, angling it toward the most targeted section of trees, and left it running. Then I waited. Sure enough, 3 nights later, I got my evidence. Under the soft glow of the moon, I reviewed the tape in my living room. There, creeping into the frame, like a burglar in some low-budget spy flick, was Karen. She wore a white button-down shirt, matching my suspicion from the fabric scrap. She had on gloves, some attempt, no doubt, to avoid leaving fingerprints, and carried a basket. My basket. She must have snatched it from my gardening shed months ago. The brazen gall. The footage showed Karen plucking apples with practiced efficiency, as if she'd done this many times before. She even paused at one point, listened for sounds, and then went right on filling her container. Watching the woman who constantly berated me about property lines and petty HOA rules commit such a blatant violation made me feel an emotion so raw I could hardly contain it. She was a hypocrite, plain and simple. I seethed for a good half hour after turning off the tape, thinking about all the times she'd threatened to fine me for inconsequential slip-ups. Now here she was, stealing fruit like it was her personal orchard. The next day, I mulled over my options. I could storm her porch, tape in hand, and confront her. But Karen was the sort who'd likely twist the narrative, or maybe even accuse me of illegal surveillance. She was cunning in her own right and well-connected in the HOA. And truth be told, I wanted something more satisfying than a simple gotcha moment. I wanted her to learn a lesson, and not just for me. For every neighbor she'd bossed around with her petty demands. I thought back to Martin. He used to say, "Sometimes the best way to teach someone a lesson is to have them trip on their own arrogance." At the time, I thought it was just a folksy turf phrase. Now it felt almost prophetic. I began to wonder, what if I turned her own methods against her? Karen loved to use the HOA's rules to discipline me. Could I use the orchard to discipline her? My plan began to take shape when I considered the stack of beekeeping boxes stashed in my shed. My father had been an amateur beekeeper, and I'd inherited some supplies after he passed. I never intended to raise bees myself, but I did have 2 unused hives, a beekeeping suit, and a well-worn smoker. That's when the wickedly sweet idea of honey came into play. If Karen wanted apples so badly, maybe I could offer her apples dipped in honey, a honey that might attract a swarm of angry bees to do the scolding for me. A bit dramatic? Absolutely. But I was fed up with her nonsense, and I knew from past experience that Karen wouldn't back down easily. She took delight in enforcing discipline. Maybe it was high time she experienced a bit of nature's discipline. After all, If my orchard was technically under her scrutiny, let her face the orchard's wilder inhabitants, bees. My father used to say that honeybees were gentle if left alone, but if you cover something in honey and place it near an active hive, you'll get more than a few interested visitors. The concept was ethically questionable. I didn't want to hurt the bees, and I certainly didn't want to kill them. But mild infiltration, an open invitation for them to investigate, that might be enough to deter Karen from stealing again. I'd place a few honey-drenched apples, sacrificial offerings, on the trees she favored. Once the bees caught wind of that sweet smell, they'd be practically buzzing in formation. Karen wouldn't know what stung her. I spent the following morning tidying up the orchard and making sure the new plan wouldn't harm the trees or the bees. Then I prepared the honey. It wasn't store-bought clover honey, either. I had a jar of raw wildflower honey, famously pungent and powerfully aromatic, the kind that, if spilled, left a lingering fragrance for days. I thinned it slightly with warm water, just enough to make a smooth mixture. Then I brushed a glossy coat on half a dozen apples, ripe but not quite at the point of spoiling. The perfect magnets for a hungry swarm. To ensure everything fell into place, I had to time Karen's next fruit heist precisely. From the previous recordings, I noticed she struck roughly every 4 to 6 days. My orchard was large enough that she could pick several dozen apples at a time without stripping every tree bare. Maybe she thought I wouldn't notice, or perhaps she enjoyed the thrill. Regardless, I set up the honey-coated apples hidden among the branches of my favorite pink lady tree, the very one she kept targeting. I positioned them so that any normal person looking for fruit would spot these plump, glistening prizes. Now, bees aren't typically active at night, so the real attraction would happen in the early morning. The plan was simple. Karen shows up under the cover of darkness, picks the honey-drenched apples, and unwittingly takes them home. Come dawn, as the honey scent wafts through her garage or kitchen, wherever she stashes her loot, the bees in the vicinity could be drawn to investigate. Bees can be early risers, especially in warm weather. If she left the apples in an open container, she'd have unexpected visitors. Or if, for some reason, she didn't pick them until early dawn, she'd be in for a much more immediate surprise. Was it foolproof? Hardly. Bees can be unpredictable, and I wasn't entirely sure this would unfold precisely as I imagined. But a part of me relished the idea that Karen was meddling with something beyond her control. If she wanted to treat my orchard like her personal grocery store, she'd now have an uninvited swarm to keep her company. To capture her reaction, I kept the trusty old camcorder in place. I was hoping to see some comedic aftermath, but as luck or misfortune would have it, Karen decided to strike earlier than usual. I just settled into bed, reading the last chapter of a mystery novel when my motion light flicked on outside. My heart thumped. I scrambled to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. Sure enough, Karen was creeping through the yard with a flashlight, basket in hand, again. She was on the prowl, probably having run out of apples and deciding to get her fix sooner. I rushed to my back door, quietly slipping on shoes. I moved in darkness around the side of my house, keeping low. The moonlight provided enough visibility to see her silhouette. She advanced on the pink lady tree, shining her flashlight upward. She must have been thrilled at the sight of those extra lustrous apples, each shining with that sticky glaze. Her hand reached out. She plucked one, turned it in the beam of her flashlight, and furrowed her brow. For a second, I worried she might realize something was off. But apparently, curiosity lost out to greed. She placed the apple in her basket, then took another and another. She was so absorbed in her petty crime that she didn't notice me standing 20 feet away behind the wide trunk of an old oak. My heart pounded so loud I feared she'd hear it. A bubble of guilty excitement welled inside me. Should I reveal myself? Confront her? A piece of me wanted to yank her by the collar and lecture her, but I stayed put, determined to let the honey do the talking. Once Karen had her fill, 8 or 9 apples, it looked like, she turned off the flashlight and scurried back around the hedges. She didn't see the note I'd left pinned to the tree trunk reading, "Next time, ask politely, Margaret." I half hoped she'd find it later. It was my only warning, so to speak. I hurried back inside, adrenaline thrumming. I'd orchestrated the best possible scenario, but anxiety still nagged me. What if the bees don't show up? Or worse, what if she realizes the apples are coated in honey and discards them before the bees have a chance to teach her anything? Worry kept me awake most of the night. Sometime around 5 a.m., I drifted off, only to be yanked from my sleep by a commotion outside my house. It was a shrill yell echoing through the air. My heart leapt. I rushed to my window again. It took a moment to orient myself in the dim morning light, but I could just make out a figure running across the side of Karen's yard, flailing her arms wildly. Even from that distance, I could hear muffled screaming, Karen's voice unmistakably. Clad in a frilly nightgown, she was sprinting away from something in her garage. Could it be the bees? I couldn't help the surge of triumph that welled up in me. Yes, it was petty satisfaction, but after enduring her nonsense all these years, I felt allowed a bit of glee. I threw on a robe and slipped outside, trying to maintain an air of innocent concern. Another neighbor, Steve, who lives across the street, stood at the edge of Karen's driveway, eyes wide. "Margaret, what's going on?" he asked in a half-whisper, half-shout. I shrugged. No idea, but it sounded like bees. Sure enough, a small cloud of buzzing insects spilled out from the open garage door. Karen appeared again, swatting at them frantically. She stumbled over a garden hose, nearly falling. With a cry that sounded part terror, part rage, she retreated further into her yard. The bees, probably enthralled by the sweet smell, followed like loyal hounds. My father's words echoed my mind. Never underestimate the power of bees attracted to honey. I forced a look of concerned confusion onto my face and hurried across the street, calling out, "Karen, are you okay?" She pivoted and glowered at me, face red as a sun-ripened tomato. Her hair stuck to her forehead in sweaty strands. I saw 3 or 4 stings on her arms and neck. She looked too furious to speak, and for a moment, I feared she might physically lash out. But the buzzing swarm kept her on the run. Finally, she managed to slam her garage door shut, trapping some of the bees inside. By the time the sun rose fully, the entire cul-de-sac buzzed with gossip. The rumor mill spun tales ranging from Karen's supposed bee allergy to a theory that she'd fallen victim to an angry hive near her property line. I kept my lips sealed about the honey-dipped apples, though I had to stifle a few giggles behind closed doors. Still, guilt nibbled at me. I never intended to harm Karen. I only wanted to teach her a lesson about boundaries. Seeing her arms covered in welts gave me a pang of regret. Even so, I wasn't about to apologize for her trespassing and theft. If she'd asked to share the orchard, or even offered to pay, I might have said yes. But she'd chosen deceit, and nature's wrath was a fitting consequence. Later that morning, the local pest control service arrived. I caught a glimpse of them hauling out a bee vacuum, specialized gear used to safely remove swarms. Karen stood at a distance, arms crossed, a permanent scowl etched into her face. She scratched at the stings on her neck. I stepped onto my porch, tried to look sympathetic. She wouldn't meet my eyes. An hour or so passed, and the activity died down. Most of the bees were relocated. Karen's driveway cleared. I decided it might be wise to approach her calmly, before she concocted some twisted tale pinning blame on me. When I knocked on her front door, it took a solid minute before she answered. Her eyes flared with suspicion. "What do you want?" she hissed. "You were attacked by bees," I said gently. "I came to see if you were all right." She snorted. "Like you care. Your precious orchard probably lured them here." I raised an eyebrow. "Funny you should mention my orchard. How did you end up with honey-coated apples in your garage?" She paled. Clearly, she hadn't expected me to know that detail. I don't know what you're talking about." The stammer in her voice was telling. "Karen, I saw you." I delivered the words calmly, though my heart was thumping. "You've been stealing my apples. And last night, you took some that were coated with honey. I don't know how they ended up coated, but it looks like it attracted bees." Her jaw worked angrily, but she said nothing. Then she tried to deflect. "Those apples were on community property. The HOA has rights." I let out a short laugh. "Community property? In my privately owned orchard? I don't think so." Her eyes narrowed to slits. "You have no proof." I lifted my phone, showing her a short clip I'd transferred from the camcorder. I have plenty. If you want to get legal about it, I'll gladly share this footage with the HOA board and the authorities. For a long moment, she stared, chest heaving. Then, in a voice stripped of its usual haughty tone, she demanded, "What do you want?" I paused. Part of me wanted to see her grovel, but I also knew that pushing too hard might spark retribution. An apology, for starters, and the promise you'll keep your hands off my orchard. Her lips tightened. Fine. I'm sorry She paused as though the words were acid on her tongue. I'm sorry I took some apples without asking. I won't do it again. Are you happy? It was the best I would get from Karen. I nodded, playing the gracious victor. That's all I wanted. I turned to leave when she spoke again, her voice trembling with resentment. Margaret, you might think you've won, but don't expect the HOA to be on your side. I turned back, exhausted by her obstinance. Karen, the HOA might have guidelines about paint colors, but they don't have a rule about private orchards. You know you're in the wrong. She didn't respond, just slammed the door. A defiant final act. Over the following weeks, I was prepared for more drama, but to my surprise, Karen stayed quiet. She no longer crept around my orchard, and I didn't receive any more hostile letters from the HOA. In fact, I found that the other board members, who had often seemed intimidated by her, started to speak more freely. One neighbor, Linda, confided that Karen's reputation had taken a hit. Word got around about her midnight forays into my yard, and while no one knew the full story, enough rumors circulated that she lost her iron grip on the association. Her attempt to fine me for trivial matters fell on deaf ears. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges, Linda stopped by to admire the orchard. She leaned in, lowering her voice. I heard Karen might be stepping down from the HOA. Really? I asked, keeping my face neutral. She says it's for health reasons, but everyone knows she's embarrassed. Linda gave me a conspiratorial wink. You wouldn't happen to know anything about a bee incident, would you? I shrugged playfully. I heard she got stung while sneaking around. Serves her right, if you ask me. Linda laughed, then turned serious. Well, I'm glad you stood your ground. She had everyone on edge. After she left, I stood alone in my orchard, feeling a mixture of relief and regret. My plan had worked. Karen had been forced to back off. Yet part of me wondered if there had been a gentler way. I shook off the thought. She stole from me, lied to my face, and tried to manipulate HOA rules for her own gain. Sometimes a swift sting of karma is the only language bullies understand. As the sun cast long shadows among my apple trees, I picked a few ripe fruits for dinner. I found myself recalling Martin's saying about arrogance and comeuppance. It rang true now more than ever. My orchard remained my sanctuary, each apple a reminder of resilience. Staring at one particularly bright pink lady apple, I bit into it with satisfaction. The crisp snap and sweet tart flavor felt like a small triumph. I'd claimed my peace, and with it, a modest victory for everyone who'd ever been pushed around by an overbearing neighbor. No, I didn't particularly enjoy orchestrating a swarm of bees to ambush Karen, but I had no doubt she'd think twice before trespassing on someone's private orchard again. I carried my basket inside, setting it gently on the countertop. Outside, the air was still, the bees presumably back to their hives. HOA or not, I finally felt the balance restored. The orchard was mine, and I protected it with a cunning plan that was part justice, part mischief. Perhaps it was a bit unorthodox, but in a world where some people feel entitled to take whatever they want, sometimes you have to stand your ground, with a little help from Mother Nature's angriest pollinators. And that was that. My orchard, my apples, and my peace, saved by a bit of honey and the righteous sting of a swarm. The end.